Welcome everybody. I'm Annie McHugh, Chair of the Board of Sustainable Living Tasmania, and on behalf of the Board and Executive Officer, I'd like to welcome you all most warmly to our conversation tonight, uncovering a shared positive vision for our future. And with great honour and pleasure, I'd like to introduce to you our patron, the Honourable Duncan Kerr, who is going to open the conversation for us tonight. Thank you so much, Duncan.
Well, thank you, Annie. And first, might I acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, the original and traditional owners of our land and their continuing guardian of it, and acknowledge their elders. Can I first welcome you to these proceedings on behalf of the board and the management and all the volunteers who are part of Sustainable Living Tasmania. I have been asked to give a little introduction to the work of Sustainable Living Tasmania, and it's worth recalling that it started out over 40 years ago, then as the Tasmanian Environment Centre in a little office in North Hobart with a handful of Tasmanians at a time when Tasmania was beginning to recognise that our nature was not inexhaustible, that the battle against the wilderness to find an opportunity for Tasmanians to produce food and settle and to build futures was pressing against boundaries that needed to be thought about. And so the Tasmanian Environment Centre was established then, as it has remained today, as a non-profit, largely volunteer-driven, community-based organisation and acutely non-political. There are many other organisations that play a directly campaigning role, but the Tasmanian Environment Centre, now Sustainable Living Tasmania, has always been focused on the notion that it provides information and gives people the opportunity to make informed choice. And in that sense, it's very much what you might regard as an enlightenment project. It's a product of optimism, not always justified, that if sound information is made available to people and they are given the opportunity to reflect on that information, they will make constructive choices. And so, from its inception, the Tasmanian Environment Centre, and now Sustainable Living, has involved itself in the management of resources, education programs. It has maintained its library. It established education and teaching programs. It has innovated projects such as the home living exhibitions. It has developed initiatives that have enabled people to measure their power consumption. As we have shifted as a community from the first stirrings of understanding that there are some boundaries against which we were pressing in relation to the wild environment, to the realisation that even the seemingly inexhaustible resources of our rivers that were harnessed for electricity to provide bulk power to large energy users were subject to constraints. So tonight is simply another step on that enlightenment project. And I'd very much like to indicate that its focus is not around conflict, but rather to open up a public and constructive debate about livelihoods that can sustain a future for all Tasmanians, and to acknowledge what we can all agree about and to rationally distinguish those elements where we may disagree, and to identify some principles and approaches to continuing and developing a conversation about how we might make well-motivated choices for the future. And so with that, I'll pass over to your facilitators for this evening, Graham, Flower and Phil Harrington. But can I also just finally acknowledge the two of the staff, albeit that the organisation has always been very much driven by its volunteers. Nonetheless, Margaret Steedman, and of course Todd Houstein, who have so much given to this organisation over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and on behalf of myself, Graham Flower and Phil Harrington, my co-conspirator this evening, we are delighted, honoured and excited to be facilitating this evening's conversation. It's great to see a lot of very familiar faces around the room and some new faces that I certainly haven't met before, and I hope we're going to have a really great dialogue, where there'll be some similarities and I'm sure some differences in your perspectives. It's wonderful to have people from business, from local government, community organisations, university and academia background, health, environment, the arts, education, primary industries, transport, and I'm sure I've left many people out. But we've got a really wide spectrum, and I think that's a wonderful thing that you've brought together here tonight. Whatever our differences, I'm pretty confident that we all share an interest and a passion in this amazing place, Tasmania, that we live in. And I'm sure that whatever the conversation unravels and reveals, we will have that in common. So Phil and I are really looking forward to the conversation this evening. Our job is to ensure that we achieve the objectives that Duncan outlined, and to make it as enjoyable and productive as an evening as we possibly can. So here's how it's going to work. Duncan did a great job of outlining the objectives. We do want to explore with you a vision of a sustainable future for Tasmania. What do you think that looks like? To open up a public constructive debate around the livelihoods and the economic model that might support that future. To acknowledge where we agree and where we disagree. And to identify some principles, some approaches, maybe some next steps in taking this conversation forward from today. Our expectation is that this will be the start of continuing discussion rather than something that finishes and concludes tonight. But that's what we'd like to hear back from you at the end. So the running order is that we'll get off and out of the way as soon as we can in completing the welcome introductions. We've then got what we've called a guided conversation. So we'll talk first about your vision for Tasmania over the next 10, 20 years. We'll then go on to, so what do you feel are the kind of livelihoods or the economic model that might support that future or those futures? And finally, where do we go from here? How do we continue this conversation? And we'll wrap the evening no later than 8 o'clock with Todd Houstein saying a few words of summary and, if appropriate, where we go from here. We do encourage you to stay on to the end for informal conversations with each other, with old friends or new acquaintances, but we will formally allow you to leave no later than 8. We are hoping to be able to open up the conversation to the floor. We may invite particular individuals to contribute on a particular question. In either case, we will be using microphones for 2 reasons. 1, so that we can hear what you're saying, and 2, so that we can record your views and your ideas. It would be really great if we could keep that positive focus on Tasmania. That's the only thing that I ask you to keep in mind, that what is going to be in the best interest, in your view, of Tasmania's future, and that we are looking primarily to the future rather than to the past. We might be able to learn things from the past, but we can't unravel it. What are we proposing for the future? If you can help us keep everyone on track, that would be wonderful. On an occasion like this, we could go almost anywhere in the conversation. So if we can keep to the reasonably broad objectives we've outlined, that would be great. Please do your best to tolerate the messiness. Phil and I don't know what's going to happen this evening. I suspect you don't either. We may get to some clear conclusions, we may not. I hope that we can just accept that that's a useful start rather than necessarily a neatly tied up conclusion. And finally, I hope we can enjoy ourselves and make the most of the time that you've committed to being here on a Friday night with the sun out. So please do make the best of the time we've got together. I think I've said enough, and it's time for me to hand over to Phil to get us into the conversation.
Thank you, Graham. So, first, an exploration, a conversation about what kind of economic vision we hold for Tasmania. Perhaps just by way of introduction, why are we even addressing a topic like that? How many of you have seen headlines in the Mercury like this or on national television? Is Tasmania bottom of the heap? This was just in October, midway through this month. Bottom of the heap. I am a Tasmanian. Grew up in kind of the wrong side of town, perhaps, but nevertheless, in Tasmania. And I've been hearing messages like this since I was a little kid, actually. I don't know how many of you have had the same experience. You know, yes, wrong side of town, maybe it was a little worse there. Grew up with more of a wooden spoon than a silver spoon in my mouth, but never mind. And like a lot of people, perhaps absorbing those messages, I went away. You know, I went away, I worked, I travelled, and eventually came back to Tasmania. I am an economist by training. I'm interested in practicing in this field of economics. I'm interested in the economic dimensions of it. But I wanted to explore with you, how do you feel when we hear, when we're told on the national media that we're bottom of the heap? Jack, you're a new arrival in Tasmania. Is Tasmania bottom of the heap? Does it feel? Why did you come here if we're bottom of the heap? Tell me.
Okay, that's hard to do briefly. But yes, certainly both the opportunities in terms of the area that I work in, renewable energy, but also family, lifestyle. Ironically, a move from the country to the city. But yeah, so a lot of the physical attractions of Tasmania combined with the potential for the sort of economic developments that I'm interested in.
Lovely, lovely. Interesting enough, that article actually says that, in very fine print at the back of the article, Tasmania's economy is growing, retail consumption is rising, and in fact our economic growth rate is at a decade-long high. But we're still bottom of the heap. Perhaps part of the background to this conversation is that I think Tasmania has been through an incredibly divisive time. The last 12 months, the last 3 years, the last 5 years. When it comes to our economic history, our recent economic history, dare I name the P word, the pulp mill, you know, but what about canal developments? What about one of the forestry crises? Take your pick. What about agriculture? What about manufacturing, processing of food closing down? What about magnesium smelters? That's a little bit older, that one. I'll put it to you that I think we've learned, I hope we've learned something from that experience of the last few years. And that is that we do not have a shared and common vision about our own economic future. Right? We know that, in fact, we've learned that it's a very divisive topic. That people hold strong views, not necessarily terribly rational views, but they hold them even more strongly because of that. So I'd like to invite you, firstly, just to perhaps pause for a minute, reflect for no more than 60 seconds, or talk to your neighbour about where that conversation, where that experience, if you've been here to share it or you've seen it from outside, where that's brought you in your thinking about our economic future. What kind of vision do you think would address those issues? And then we'll resume the conversation and ask you to share your views with us. Just 1 minute. So I'm going to turn now to invite anyone who wants to take the floor to share with us their vision for Tasmania's economic future. I will remind you that in inviting you here, we posed 3 kinds of questions. Is it possible for us to continue with what we might call the old economy? That's maybe a dirty phrase. What do I mean by the old economy? Perhaps the economy that we had in the 50s and 60s, the manufacturing-based, the agricultural-based, the primary goods, that kind of thing, minerals processing. Is it possible to continue with that model even if we wanted to? But secondly, to the extent that we think perhaps not, maybe there are some challenges with that model, do we think that the so-called new economy that we hear a lot about can actually employ us, can sustain the kind of future that we want? And then we'll address that in our third question when we finish our conversation tonight. Dare I pass to Elaine? There were hands? Please, Penny.
Okay, I'd like to suggest that
Is the microphone coming?
part of the problem might be the way that this economic success is being measured, and that maybe gross domestic product isn't the best measure.
Yeah.
And if these factors are taken into advantage,
Yeah.
account, perhaps we're not at the bottom of the heap after all.
Exactly.
Just getting the hang of this.
Yes. I don't feel like I'm bottom of the heap, actually.
No, I
Even
really
if
don't.
GSP tells me that I am. You know? Fantastic. Phil.
Thanks, Phil. To me, as an economist, it's not, the issue isn't necessarily about how we measure it. And the article that Phil's pointing to isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all, and it's actually a lot of very broad measures. But to me, the long-term future is the opportunities that my kids and their kids will have. And my kids are 9 and 7. And when you put it in the framework of what we have here in Tasmania, we actually have a very diverse economy. So, and it's often under-recognised that there are no dominant sectors other than government and some government-related services here in Tasmania. So when we talk about the old economy, we actually need it, because that is providing growth, it is providing jobs, and opportunities ultimately comes from jobs. Yeah. If you don't have jobs, we all know you don't have those opportunities. And so therefore, when we talk about transition from what we have in the old economy to the new economy, well, there are no sectors that we can point to put your finger on and say that is going to be our long-term future. And so therefore it might be even services to those old economy sectors, but those old economy sectors are still significant employment
They are.
in Tasmania, and they shouldn't be discarded. And when you talk about opportunities, it's not just we talk about our children leaving. Well, they always have. Phil left. I have no doubts.
I'm kicking mine out.
Yeah.
They won't go.
But my children may well leave, but the question is, do they have something to come back to? And if we discard what we have,
So if we
may
picked it
not
up,
have that.
okay? So I don't think anyone's discarding the old economy. I think we're struggling to hang on to it. One might suggest, and we might talk about the role of government if we might, that actually we're trying our hardest to hang on to the old economy. Phil, this is going to be dominated by the Phils, eh? 3 in a row. Are we hanging on to the old economy? And is that getting in the way of moving towards a new economy?
I tend to agree in the sense that the old economy, but the old economy must get much smarter. The old economy must find different ways to do things. I think the Sense T project working out of the university is a good example of that, where the old economy has to shift its ways. If you want to open a mine, then you have to cost in the factor it doesn't wreck the river. That's not acceptable anymore, and you need proper processes and values around that development. And I think the battles can be won in Tasmania if we have values that say, yes, we support some of these aspects of development, but there's a set of values that come with them, and we will enforce those values. Yeah. That's how you transition the old economy and keep it without losing some of the new economy as well. Yeah. It's a different set of values applied to it and a different set of measurement that says whether it's successful or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Ron, you prepared to share your thoughts with us? You're running businesses, have run businesses operating in the new economy. How is that?
I'll share a few thoughts. One of the keys, there are a lot of elements to the conversation, but one of the keys I would have thought to shape a new economy is that we have to have strong leadership. Yeah. And the reality, and it's already been referred to, you referred to it yourself, the diverse views we have in the community, we have to somehow or other get a more collegiate approach. Recognising the reality is we're never going to get everyone on the same page. But if you have strong leadership, and if we get a good vision out of tonight, and that could be picked up by that leadership, where whoever it is or wherever it is, then we might start heading down the right path.
Yeah. At the back, Suhail.
I think we cannot separate the discussion on economy from the management of the resources, which also includes human resources.
Yeah.
So the first question is, do we have a full understanding of our human resources in Tasmania? Do we know what kind of society is in Tasmania? 49% of Tasmanians are supposed to be functionally illiterate from the last statistics. 1 in 5 are suffering from one form of or another form of mental problem.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, there are a lot of social problems, of course, and a lot of talents. So I think the challenge is in capacity building, increasing literacy and knowledge base, and even using the opportunities that happens in Tasmania, such as events and functions that happens in Tasmania. You know, if there is, for example, a conference in here by surgeons or by chemists from another part of the world, they bring themselves a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of really know-how that can be somehow shared with the community.
Yeah.
So if we can allow the community to participate in some of these events,
Yeah.
it also is very helpful.
Okay. Now, Elena, I'm going to have another go. You're not getting away that easily. Do we have the skills in our young people to make a transition to a different kind of economy? Margaret's coming with a microphone. On this wonderful little island we live on. Yeah. Do we have the skills that we need to make a transition to a sustainable economy in Tasmania?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question for me. I think that one of the things that we absolutely have to address is the way in which the narrative of Tasmania is based historically in shame and guilt.
Yeah.
Shame and guilt are deeply demoralizing and deeply destabilizing narratives. That's the first point I would make. The second point, and I think that we should, and I made this point the other day in another forum, I think that every time we hear that, we should now robustly say, excuse me, I beg your pardon.
Exactly.
Where's your evidence? That's the first point. Tasmania has huge amounts of investment going on right now. And it's really significant and it's really exciting. The second point I would make is around education, which is one of my passions, and education for island children in particular. You know, we think of children somehow as human becomings, as though they're not full citizens until they're 18. Do we have the skills? No, I don't think we do. I would go so far as to say the education system in this state is broken. I would go so far as to say that as long as our year 11 and 12 is separated from our schools, and that we don't have sufficient numbers of teachers or different ways of delivering education, it will stay that way.
Yeah.
I would say to you that the 10 postcodes that feed the prison need to be addressed. When Joan Kerner had major interventions in Victoria for early childhood years in her 10 worst postcodes, 12 to 17 years later, they had the lowest rates of youth unemployment and the lowest rates of youth imprisonment in the country.
Yeah.
Now, those are statistics that I can wear.
Yeah.
I want us to invest several tens of millions for generations into those areas.
Yeah.
Because I look in the eyes of children that I go and talk to in Bridgewater and Gagebrook, and they are just as capable and just as keen to stand up and be citizens of this fabulous island
We're allowed
state.
to applaud, by the way. Thank you, Elaine.